Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Welcome back again. I want to take some time off from directly looking through the syllabus in order at the moment. And I'd like to spend this video just talking about, as you can see on the screen, United Nations agreements about sustainability and about sustainable development. So this isn't necessarily something that you'll see directly on the syllabus, but it's a common thread that runs throughout the course. These agreements are, well, they're good case studies, good evidence for that you might want to use in essay questions in the exams, and also, well, the syllabus specifically says that we need to look at three types of organisation: IGOs, GOs, and NGOs, and this is a good point at which we can do that. So before we carry on, some definitions. An IGO is an intergovernment organisation. So it's basically a gathering of governments. So that would include organisations like the United Nations itself, and also agencies that belong to the United Nations, like the World Health Organization or UNESCO, organisations like that. Then we come to GOs. GO stands for Government Organisation. So basically, that involves departments of government. In our terms, we'll specifically be looking at departments of the environment or environment agencies. And then we get to the third group, which is called an NGO, which you're probably familiar with. An NGO is a non-government organisation or non-governmental organisation, which would include groups like Greenpeace. They have the advantage of not being restrained by government or by IGOs. They're not part of those things. But a disadvantage is they're not always accountable to the people and not always accountable to government. Okay, so before we move on, you can see the list of agreements, international agreements that I've decided to look at above my head. Looking at that now, that seems like an awful lot, and I hope I've not bitten off more than I can chew here. So I'm going to look at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Is that 8? 8 agreements. I've really cherry picked the ones I'm going to look at. I'm going to look at those agreements that were specifically about sustainable development and sustainability. But many of these are more specifically about climate change. And I don't think you can divorce the idea of climate change and the climate change agreements from the idea of sustainability itself, which we'll see as we go through. Okay, I hope I don't spend too much time on each one, but let's kick off. So the first one I want to look at is the 1972 Stockholm Conference. That might seem like a long time ago to you. It was actually just before I was born, not that long ago in my terms. But believe it or not, it was the first international environmental conference. I've mentioned this before. The environmental movement really kicked off in 1967, the Summer of Love, with the publication of Rachel Carson's book Silent Spring. It was around the time of the hippie movement, and it was kind of that push towards environmental issues kicked off the first environmental conference, which was in Stockholm, Sweden. At that point, obviously, as I've mentioned before, the United Nations had not defined the idea of sustainable development, but nevertheless, the conference itself was about sustainability, and it really established, I know you're sick of seeing this now, our old friend, the three pillars of sustainability and sustainable development, even though the phrase had not really been coined. So the United Nations was really looking at the social, the environmental aspects, and the economic aspects of human existence. So what else can I say? You could argue there were not a lot of positive outcomes. I would argue that there possibly were. It was a bit derailed by the United States that really wanted to avoid scrutiny of the Vietnam War at that time. There was a lot of environmental damage being being caused in Vietnam by the use of napalm and the defoliant chemical agent orange, and also the effects that those agents had on wildlife and on humans as well, specifically children. So Nixon was the president at the time, and he really tried to move attention away from the Vietnam War. In some ways, that was positive because it led the UN to focus on things like whaling, and after the conference, there was the first international moratorium on whaling. Also, many delegations left the conference and went off to form their own environment agencies and their own departments of the environment. Nixon himself was actually ahead of the game because he'd formed the United States Environmental Protection Agency in 1970. He was actually quite a committed environmentalist in a lot of ways. It brought together about 400 NGOs and over 100 GOs, over 100 governments, to actually discuss for the first time the issues that were actually affecting environment and environmental change. Okay, so let's move on. I don't want to spend too much time on each one. The next one I chose to look at, I cherry picked this one again, was in 1979. The first World Climate Conference was held in Geneva, Switzerland. It brought together IGOs and GOs again, including the ones you can see on the screen. And it led to the creation of, later actually, the International Panel on the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, which was very important in, as we'll see later, specifically climate conferences. It might surprise you that in 1979, governments were actually discussing climate change. Probably to you, it seems like quite a recent discovery or a recent problem. That's actually not correct. In the 1800s, in 1896, the Swedish scientist Arrhenius actually first started to postulate that humans could have an effect on climate change by pumping fossil fuel wastes into the atmosphere. So it wasn't a new thing by any means. It was basically a scientific conference. In a lot of ways, it wasn't really a United Nations conference. It was bringing together scientific organizations to discuss the effect that humans were having on the environment, specifically on climate. Okay, so that conference led to other agreements later on down the line. Then we can move on into the 1980s. I've already mentioned this woman. This is Gro Harlem Brundtland. And in 1983, she was tasked by the United Nations Secretary General, who at that time I believe was Peruvian guy, Javier Perez de Cuellar. He set up a commission where he wanted Brundtland and her team specifically to look at sustainability and sustainable development. And it was because of the realization at that time that humans were starting to have an effect on natural capital, as we've discussed before. So it was active between 1983 and 1987. It was disbanded in 1987 when Brundtland published her report, which was called Our Common Future. And it was most important because it actually defined for the first time the term sustainable development. And it led to the adoption of some of the things she championed in her report, and new legislation in governments all around the world specifically about sustainable development. And we'll come to that again, I'm sure. Moving on again, we can move into the 90s. You've probably heard of the Rio Earth Summit. It was held in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. And it was the 20th anniversary of the Stockholm Conference, which we've already said was the birth of the environmental movement. So the UN saw it as a chance to rethink the economy. And it was actually a move towards pushing a more circular economy around the world. It had a lot of goals. maybe too many in some ways, which, as usual with these UN conferences, um, very often there's a very laudable aims, many laudable aims, but very difficult to put into practice. The UN itself has not got any teeth. It's not able to push governments or punish them in any kind of ways for not achieving any goals that they agree to. Um, and when you look through the history of UN agreements, in some ways it's quite uplifting because it's generally very laudable what they try to achieve, but in some ways it's quite depressing because so many governments end up reneging on their promises or just not meeting them at all. Okay, so it's probably most famous for the report, the cover of which you can see on the right hand side of the screen there, which was called Agenda 21. It was called Agenda 21 because the 21 refers to the year 2021, which was the year when the parties at the summit hoped that all of the goals would have been accepted worldwide. Um, uh, they looked at biodiversity, economics, and more specifically climate change. You probably guessed that the goals are not really close to being met in 2021, which is next year as we speak, and therefore it was later modified that the goals will be met in 2030. The goals themselves changed as well. The goalpost changed by the time of the Paris Accord, which we'll come to a little bit later. And all the time that the governments are discussing these proposals that were made in Agenda 21, we're moving closer and closer towards the time, possibly in your lifetime, when we'll hit this tipping point where irreversible climate change will happen. Moving on again. We'll stay in the 1990s. This is possibly one that you've not heard of, but it's more specifically about sustainability and sustainable development. In 1993, the UN revisited the idea of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was first signed soon after the Second World War in 1948. It was a conference in which the UN established that basically human rights are dependent on sustainable development. You can't really divorce the two things. The 1948 UN Universal Declaration on Human Rights was actually not universal. It wasn't signed by a lot of members, a few members of the United Nations. They had various religious motivations. In some countries, the religion didn't really agree with giving equal rights to men and women. And some countries didn't like the idea that was pushed by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that education should be a human right for all children. So it already had problems because it wasn't adopted by all of the members. But as I've said there, it did come up with some principles that governments should aspire to in terms of human rights linked to sustainable development. But ultimately, it didn't really establish any precedents or hold any governments to account for that. Okay, now you've probably heard of the next one. We're still in the 90s, and then we reached the 1997 Kyoto Protocol in Kyoto, Japan. This followed a 1995 agreement where the United Nations established something called the COP, which is the Conference of the Parties. That was an agreement between a group of countries that had a stake in trying to prevent climate change. And they'd met, the COP, the COP, had met every year since 1995 and continues to do so. And 1997 was basically the third time that they'd met. It was the first time that the COP tried to come to concrete agreements about what was needed to try to reduce climate change. At that stage, really every country in the world had started to come to agreement that it was a global problem that needed global solutions. Um, so, in some ways, they came to very successful agreements. It was agreed in the Kyoto Protocol um, that greenhouse gas emissions should be stabilized at 1996 levels. So, basically, bring them down and stabilize them at those levels. Unfortunately, it ran into trouble straight afterwards. Uh, George Bush Jr. basically refused to ratify the Kyoto Protocol because of what he saw was injustices between what the United States was expected to do and what LEDCs, specifically China, um, were held accountable for. So Bush saw that the United States economy would have to suffer um, at the expense of other developing economies like China, and therefore he pulled out. He was followed later on by Canada, France, Russia, and Japan. Those countries, including the United States, later signed the Paris Accord. So there was some signs that maybe they were going to put that right. I want to talk specifically a bit later about the Kyoto Protocol. It introduced some very important things like carbon trading. That meant that MEDCs that produced a lot of greenhouse gases could continue to develop their economy, but they could pay LEDCs basically to have planting programs that would take the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere that they produced. Bush was right in some ways that the onus was on MEDCs to try to solve the problem, but that was because the MEDCs were the big producers of global greenhouse gases. It's pretty obvious what this cartoon is saying, by the way. It's George Bush Jr. smoking a big cigar and pushing his smoke over towards the other members of the United Nations. Ironically, it was George Bush Sr. who had signed the Rio Summit in 1992, and George Bush Jr. that pulled the United States out of that agreement. Okay, so we'll come back to Kyoto, I'm sure. Moving on again, we get to the year 2000. The year 2000 was obviously the turn of the millennium, and it was seen by the UN as a good point at which to reassess what the world was doing in terms of sustainability. It was a 3-day conference held in New York City, and it was the largest United Nations gathering of all time up to that point. The main thing that came out of it is what you can see here on the slide, the 8 Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs. And they basically established what each country was expected to achieve in terms of sustainable development. So I hope it's visible. These are the nice little graphics that were produced at the time. I'll read them out one by one. So number 1, the eradication of extreme poverty and hunger. Number 2, achieving universal primary education for all children. Number 3, the promotion of gender equality and the empowerment of women, which we'll see is very important in terms of population control when we get to topic 8. Number 4, reduction of child mortality. Number 5, an improvement in maternal health. The ability of all women to give birth in healthy surroundings. Number 6, the combating of HIV/AIDS, malaria, and other global illnesses, which is very prescient today as we live through the COVID pandemic. Number 7, ensuring environmental sustainability, very wide-ranging one. And number 8, the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development. They were all quite vague, and they developed in many ways up to the present day, and we'll return to the MDGs as we go through the course again. But just be aware of their existence. Whether they were a success or not, whether the summit was a success, is open to interpretation. When I was just reading about this, just in preparation for making this video, I read a couple of quotes that were delivered by Ban Ki-moon, who was the United Nations Secretary General at the time. Well, actually later on as they were revisited, the MDGs. In 2010, I wrote down a quote that he said. He said that the MDGs were not a success due to unmet commitments, inadequate resources, lack of focus, and lack of accountability, and insufficient interest in sustainable development by governments around the world. He followed that up in 2015 when he kind of contradicted himself, and he said the MDGs by then were a success because they lifted 1 billion people out of poverty, which I'm sure is true to an extent, and they give millions of girls and women access to education for the first time. So, again, it's typical of these United Nations agreements. The proof is in the pudding, and the proof of whether they're successful or not, I guess, is down to interpretation. Okay. I should also say that it was agreed in 2000 that there will be follow-up meetings every 5 years, and I believe they happened up to 2015, which was the target for which the MDG should have been met. I'm sure we can probably agree they haven't been met. And I think those meetings were abandoned after 2015. Okay, and then keeping around the clock, we'll get to the final one I want to look at, which is 2015, and it's the Paris Accord, which I guess you're possibly old enough just to just about remember. At the time, it was seen as a huge success. All of the members of the COP, the COP, it was the 21st meeting of the COP, by the way, they all agreed to the same the same points of agreement to actually tackle climate change. And all the nations there agreed to accelerate the action that was needed and intensify the investment that was needed to meet the goals that were originally set out in Kyoto, the 2030 goals. However, like I said before, the goalposts kind of shifted. By then it was kind of seen that it wasn't really possible to, at that point, to reach the 1996 levels that were originally agreed at Kyoto. So basically what was agreed at Paris was that governments would do whatever is necessary to limit climate change to 2 degrees Celsius as a maximum, higher than levels basically before the Industrial Revolution. That might seem like something that's achievable, but basically this 2-degree global increase is what is agreed by most climate scientists as, if we go above that, it would be a catastrophic change and probably the tipping point where we can't really get back down to current levels. So really, it was the last push to achieve stability of global temperatures before it was too late. Like I said, it was seen as a big success, a huge agreement of all of the COP. But since then, when President Trump came to power in 2016, he's vowed ever since to pull the United States out of the Paris Agreement. Similarly to George Bush Jr., who saw it as an unfair imposition on US industry and the United States taxpayer at the expense of other countries like China, who were still able to develop their economies. Trump will only be able to pull the United States out of the agreement in 2020, and that's due to happen one day after the November presidential elections in 2020. So we'll have to see what happens. I'm recording this in June 2020. It'll be interesting to come back and look at it. Okay, now I hope that didn't take too long, and I hope you found it interesting. I know it was just me delivering a monologue. I'll send you, when I upload this to our Google Classroom, I'll send it you with some of the articles and things, and obviously we'll keep coming back to all of these things as we go along. As I've gone through it, I've realised that I kind of confuse these things. There's an awful lot of agreements, and this is only kind of scratching the surface. But it's useful information to have at your fingertips if you understand what was agreed at each of these stages from the Stockholm Conference, at least up to the 2015 Paris Accord. Okay, so that's it for now. Take care, everybody. Look after yourselves, as I always say, and your own health. And I will speak to you at our next lesson.